Hi class, it's Professor Irey. I've gotten some questions about the EEOC and specifically about the assignment that talks about the factors that impact EEOC. I'll explain more of this when I get to campus, when I'm doing the other lectures and we're getting ready for the final. But what I wanted to do is just kind of give you an overview and some quick information about what we're talking about with the EEOC and with those factors. So overall, the factors that are impacting the EEOC, I put them into three general categories, and they're broken out more in detail in your text. So the idea that politics and policy, legal changes, and socioeconomic evolution of a society really drive changes and evolutions and, how the EEOC enforces its rules and what rules it has to enforce. So, for instance, and when I say EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission is that governing body in the United States that enforces the laws to make sure employees and candidates for jobs are not discriminated against because they are a member of a specific type of group or classification of people. And I'll review the classifications. And the federal classifications, there's less categories than there are. States actually expand that and add additional categories, And I will be flipping back and forth and referring to my notes that you can't see off screen over here. So first of all, when we talk about factors that impact really the evolution of equal employment opportunities in this country, first we'll talk about politics and policy. So as the makeup of the workforce changes, as politics change and move forward, different parties, different people come into politics and basically into power, they set the precedent, they set the guidelines, and they also react to the citizens of what they want. So, for example, the biggest one, which also goes hand in hand with the change in the laws and expanding laws and evolving laws, the biggest one for that is the Civil Rights Act, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That is the biggest law that establishes rights for employees and candidates to not be discriminated against based on their ethnicity, their gender, their religion, their national origin. Those are the big categories. So someone cannot refuse a promotion to an employee who is a woman simply on the basis that they want to give it to a man because the woman can't handle the additional hours. Well, nobody asked her if she can handle the additional hours. I myself work a lot more hours than my male counterparts. So that's an example of when the Civil Rights Act, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, really changed how employment was conducted in this country. Because prior to that law passing, employers did not have to hire women. They basically could choose to hire men. Well, if, I hire the woman, I can pay her less, so that's a bonus. Not anymore. We don't do that. You don't discriminate based solely on gender. So the political will to really look at the changes, and if you look at in this country what was happening in 1964 or when this law started to develop in the 60s, it was all about the women's rights movement and minority rights, and that's where a lot of these laws come from, because the political will was there. The people who elected the officials told them these are the laws we want. We want more equal opportunity for people to, work and earn a paycheck and prove themselves and, improve their career and rise up through the ranks based on their work, not be held back on factors that have nothing to do with work. So that's where we're talking about the political factor. The next thing I would say is the legal, which obviously goes hand in hand, but the legal factors. The law around equal employment has evolved constantly over the last 100 years. The laws are slow to move, but in response to things that happen, they're not proactive, but laws are responding to things that happen in this country and changing environments. So there are a lot of laws that really impacted what employers could and could not do, and laws that make employees feel protected in the workplace, which is very important. You go to work, not to be harassed, not to be discriminated against, but to be treated equally amongst your peers. So the laws, and there's a lot of them obviously in our text when we talk about them, but the laws give us that overview, and you can see the progression of how the country changed based on the laws that it passed. So when we're talking about political will, we're talking about how many laws and the legal evolution of this country and how our laws shape that, and they shapes the EEOC. And then the third category, I would say, is socioeconomic, and that basically means the changing makeup of the population. As the population began to evolve, you had more women returning to the workplace. You had more, you had two-income households because people started to feel the crunch that, it was no longer the ideal situation of, and it's not necessarily ideal, but the history of the man working and the woman staying home and rearing the children and taking care of the house. At the late 60s, early 70s, there was this massive migration of women back into the workforce. However, they were returning to the workforce, they were educated, they had experience, and if they didn't have experience, they had education, but they were treated that, they weren't nearly as good as a man, regardless of what their experience and what their work would be. So they were hired as secretaries. One of the greatest examples I can give you is a Supreme Court justice who, when I worked in D.C., I worked on Capitol Hill for a congressman for a brief time. I had the opportunity to meet Supreme Court Justice at the time, our judge, Sandra Day O'Connor, amazing woman. But when she first finished law school, she could not get a job as a lawyer. She was only hired as a paralegal to support the real lawyers because they were all men. Another Supreme Court justice and one of my personal heroes who I have not met, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, same thing. When she finished law school, because she was a woman, and only because she was a woman, she could not get a job as a lawyer. So those are giving examples of, the changing makeup of society. So, for instance, one of the big societal changes we have in this current decade, moving into the next one soon, is that many millennials, and that's your 18 to 35-year-old-ish, it's moving up a little every year, and the generation behind them who will be turning 18, they're called Generation Z. They're called Zoomers, if you don't know that. I just learned that. They've been labeled Zoomers because of their speed of adaptation of technology, and some of you may be Zoomers. I don't know. But Zoomers and millennials support gay rights at much, much higher numbers than their parents do. So at some point in this country, and we're seeing it now, we're seeing a shift for more, and an outcry for more rights for the LGBTQIA community. And again, we'll talk about what all that stands for, but in general, the non-conforming gender community, the LGBTQIA, lesbian, gay, bi, transsexual, I'm good on to that. But so there's a huge shift in a demand to give them equal rights. Now, while the federal government does not have laws that recognize it, many states and smaller jurisdictions and cities within those states have passed laws that give equal rights to this particular community. It's something we would have never seen in the 50s. It's something we would have never seen even in the 60s and 70s. So the socioeconomic impact, so the example of, the women returning to the workforce, and the just general societal impact of, a changing society, are examples of, how the EEOC has to respond to enforcement, how they have to, administer their regulations, and the demand and change for more inclusive society. So I hope that gives you a little bit of an overview and gives you an idea. Under each of those major categories, there are tons of examples. I just listed some, especially if we're talking about the law. There's tons and tons and tons of laws because the EEOC enforces workplace discrimination laws. They make sure that people are not being discriminated based on any of the protected classes I named, based on a disability. The Americans with Disabilities Act. That came out in the 90s, and it was response to political pressure and for pressure to create a more inclusive citizenry and workplace environments. So there's tons of example under any of those three factors. So I hope that helps. I'm looking forward to seeing everybody on campus, and I'll be posting our final video lecture coming up very soon. But this was just a snippet to respond and make sure everybody had the correct information. So if you have questions, please email me. Everybody should have my email contact. I'm happy to respond. I'm happy to elaborate on anything. If something you don't understand, just certainly let me know and reach out. So thank you very much. Have a great night. Take care.